I forgot to push the button, so it's recording now.
Okay, awesome.
So do you want me to redo the intro?
No, that's okay.
All right,
I can, yeah, I'll just pick up where I left off.
perfect.
So yeah, anyways, the research that I'm doing here in Colombia is about silvopastoral systems, which is the inclusion of trees and shrubs in pastoral, fragmented pastoral environments, and basically how that alternative agricultural practice influences the longevity of forest-dependent birds in these fragmented landscapes. So essentially looking at the colonization and extinction dynamics in systems that have silvopasture in them, and traditional systems as well. So in the question sessions, I'm happy to talk more about my PhD work as well, if that's of interest to anyone. And so yeah, with that, I'll get started here on the on this talk. So the eastern whippoorwill is both a nocturnal or a neotropical migrant and an aerial insectivore, two groups of birds which are experiencing precipitous declines. So this figure here on the top right shows the biomass recorded by weather stations. So the biomass of migrants recorded by weather stations from 2007 to 2017, and you can see it's declined about 10% in that time period. And this figure here on the bottom left shows the precipitous declines of aerial insectivores, which are shown here in this pink line, which is actually the steepest decline of all the birds looked at. So yeah, they're in two groups of steeply declining birds. But yeah, the star of the show today is going to be the eastern whippoorwill, which is a cryptic bird, which means it's well camouflaged and nocturnal. And so I'm going to play its song here. So you guys are hearing that. This is really an iconic song. An iconic song of the eastern hardwood forests, and it might not be as common as it used to be, and it's really a lovely song. I definitely learned to love it during my master's, except when they're right outside your window, then it's pain in the butt. And fortunately, the fact that they're so vocal on the breeding grounds makes them a lot easier to study for biologists. You can imagine a bird that's well camouflaged and mostly active at night would be really difficult to study, but the song that they belt out actually alerts scientists to their presence and allows us to understand or to document them much better. But not surprisingly, they're almost non-vocal outside of the breeding season. So to date, breeding grounds research dominates for this species and for many other nightjars and cryptic or nocturnal species. So there's a knowledge gap outside of the breeding season. So I want to talk briefly about the full annual cycle approach to conservation and what that means. I'm sure most of you all are familiar with a figure like this, basically showing the 4 phases of the annual cycle of migratory birds: breeding, autumn migration, overwintering period, and spring migration. And so what happens here are neotropical migrants are breeding, and then as soon as the cold weather starts rolling in, the migrants and our Florida retirees pack things up with their mint mojitos and migrate down south. And I've paused this animation here on the overwintering period because that's actually where migrants spend the majority of their annual cycle. So for most birds, at least 6 months of the year are actually spent on the wintering grounds. And then they pack up again, gearing up for breeding, and migrate in the spring back to their breeding grounds and do this year after year. And so the events that occur outside of the breeding season can be really important for determining the number of individuals that return to the breeding grounds, and also the condition that those individuals return in. So I want to direct everyone's attention now to this figure in the top right, which shows the percent change of whippoorwill populations per year. So essentially the warmer colors represent steeper declines in whippoorwill populations, and the cooler colors actually represent increases in whippoorwill populations. And so you can see that these population trends are very non-uniform. Some areas are increasing, others are decreasing, and they're often right next to each other. So there's really two options when you see a figure like this. One is that events on the breeding grounds are causing these differential population trends, or the other is that populations are remaining cohesive through other phases of the annual cycle, and events outside of the breeding season are actually limiting populations and causing these differential population trends. So I'm going to explain that a lot more with an example, and hopefully everything will be clear. But before I move on, I wanted to highlight that overall whippoorwills have declined over 70% in the last 50 years. Okay, so this figure here is showing the golden wing warbler, and basically two of their breeding regions here, with distinct population trends. So here we have the Great Lakes region in red and the Appalachian region here in orange or yellow. And this line here, this black line, represents the population trends in these two regions since the 1960s. So you can see that the Great Lakes region has maintained a relatively stable population, whereas the Appalachian population has absolutely taken a nosedive. And what's interesting is these lines here connect individuals on the breeding grounds to their wintering location. And you can see that individuals in the Great Lakes almost exclusively overwinter in Central America, whereas individuals in the Appalachian region almost exclusively winter in northern South America. And the real damning evidence here that suggests that it's events in the wintering period that are actually causing these population trends, these differences in the population trends, is that the deforestation rates line up on the deforestation rates on the wintering grounds line up almost perfectly with the population trends, which are measured on the breeding grounds. So this line here in the background is the deforestation rate in Central America, and here it is in Southern North America, or South America, in this region here. So that's evidence suggesting that events outside of the breeding season are actually determining those differential population trends. And so there's a scientific term or measure, a standardized measure for this phenomena, which is called migratory connectivity. And don't worry, this is the only scientific jargon I'm going to throw at you guys today, but it was a super important piece of my thesis, and so I wanted to just take a second to explain it here. And so again, it's a standardized measure for population cohesion throughout the annual cycle. And so here's another example with the rose-breasted grosbeak of strong or high migratory connectivity, because these distinct breeding populations remain distinct on the wintering grounds. And here's an example of weak migratory connectivity in the green-winged teal. And so this is really important for conservation planning because one, like the example of the golden-winged warbler, it can help us understand where the population limiting events occur throughout the full annual cycle. It doesn't make that much sense to invest a bunch of conservation money into the breeding grounds if the problem area for a given species is actually on the wintering grounds. And on the other hand, if there's weak or low migratory connectivity, it can highlight really important areas that could be useful to conserve. So in the example of the green-winged teal here, you might say, okay, the coast around the Gulf of Mexico is really important because individuals from across the breeding range are all coming together around the Gulf of Mexico. And so conservation dollars there would impact individuals across a really large range on the breeding grounds. So for the eastern whippoorwill, excuse me, I wanna take a second and just, if there are any questions, now is a great time to ask them, just because that, as I said, that was really the only super scientific or jargony term I'm going to throw at you guys. So if there's any questions or confusions, now is a great time to ask them.
I think we're good.
All right, I'll continue on then. So these broad scale distributional patterns are really key to understanding population limitation throughout the full annual cycle. But an understanding of fine scale habitat or space use is also really important. And for a lot of individuals, especially those that are cryptic and nocturnal, we lack basic information on life history outside of the breeding season. So it was only recently a study published by Chris, my advisor, in 2019 that documented for the first time even the habitat requirements of the whippoorwill in the overwintering period. So this was a very small sample size. There were only 11 individuals, and they came from Ohio. So you got to take these findings with a grain of salt. But for these individuals, they showed an affinity for forest. You can see here this green color represents forest. So for example, here are 3 individuals that only had forest in their home ranges. And they had overall really small home ranges, much smaller than they were on the breeding grounds. But obviously with such a small sample size and individuals from just one state, it would be super beneficial to expand this study effort. And expanding the study effort would also allow us to test potential hypotheses about the fine scale winter ecology. So we were particularly interested in whether the conversion of forests to agriculture might impact space use, which we measured as home range size in this case. And just to clarify, the home range is just the area in which an animal lives and moves on a regular basis. So we couldn't actually measure insects in this case, but one hypothesis or one potential mechanism that could be important here is that agriculture negatively impacts insects. And then that change in food supply alters the space use or the requirements of the space requirements for individuals to meet their metabolic needs, their caloric intake. So that was one thing we were interested in testing. Okay, so just to explicitly state our objectives here, the overarching objective was to elucidate the basic non-breeding season ecology of the eastern whippoorwill. And we wanted to calculate migratory connectivity, identify migratory routes, and stopover and wintering locations. Additionally, we wanted to understand how the overlap in time and space changes throughout migration. I didn't touch on that too much yet, but I'll delve into that going forward. And finally, we wanted to explore the predictors of home range size across multiple spatial scales. But I already said that this species of bird is very well camouflaged and nocturnal and non-vocal on the wintering grounds. So how are we gonna achieve these objectives? Well, the miniaturization of GPS technology has really been incredible in the past decade or so. This is the same technology that's been around for multiple decades now, but it's really only become small enough in the past 10 years or so to start going on smaller and smaller birds. The tags that we deployed were a little over 1 gram, and they can go on birds as small as 20 grams. And this is just a testimony of how fast this technology is evolving. Just a few months ago, I was in a Paramo site in the Andes, and they were using what are called life tags, which actually have solar panels, small solar panels on the tags to track hummingbird movements. So these hummingbirds, I mean, the biggest one, they were only tracking the biggest ones, which were maybe 7 or 8 grams. We're actually receiving tags that should last a lifetime in theory and provide a lifetime of movement data. So it just goes to show what's happened to the technology since we bought these tags in 2019. And so these tags take GPS locations that are precise to 5 to 10 meters. And the downside is that they must be recovered to acquire the data. There are other tags that actually transmit the information to receivers, and then you don't have to recapture the bird to get that data, but those tend to be larger tags. The mechanisms required to or the materials required to transmit that information is heavy, and so then they wouldn't be able to go on birds as small as the whippoorwill. So we had 2 deployment seasons. These were our deployment sites here. 5 different breeding sites across the Midwestern US, and overall we deployed 115 tags and we recaptured 52 working tags. And these tags took a GPS location every 4th or 5th day from August to April in the respective year. All right, I'm gonna get into results here now. For our first objective, we wanted to look at key wintering areas and calculate migratory connectivity. So these blue circles, or these blue kind of rasterized pixels here, represent the 50% core winter utilization distribution from our 5 breeding sites. The 5 breeding sites are up here at the top of each panel. The dots represent the actual wintering location of a given individual from that breeding site. And panel F here shows the wintering locations of all individuals and the core utilization distribution of all individuals combined. So as you can see, there's a lot of overlap between these different breeding regions. And predominantly individuals are going to southern Mexico and northern Central America. And so if we think back to our standardized measurement of migratory connectivity, that was weak or low migratory connectivity. Okay, for key, the next part of objective 1 was to identify key stopover regions. This map here is color coded, so you can see here where individuals are leaving from, and these circles, which represent stopover locations, those are the same color as the deployment location here. So these represent migratory tracks essentially, and these inflection points, for example, here where my cursor is an inflection point, is where the GPS tag actually took a point. And so essentially we have a series of points through time, and all we did here was connect the dots. These circles represent first stopover locations, and these red diamonds represent second stopover locations. And the size of the circle or the diamond represents the duration of that stopover. So overall, they stopped over for 4 to 15 days, average of about 6.4 days. We couldn't detect anything under 4 days, right? If you remember back to our sampling schedule there, the minimum sampling frequency was every 4 days. And I'd like to highlight here where this red circle is. 12 out of 21 individuals that stopped over in this region, which is basically the Ozarks Plateau, the Ouachita Mountains, and the prairies and forests of eastern Texas. So this is another really important region that we should consider for conservation action, because whippoorwills are definitely stopping in this region to refuel and gain energy to continue along their migratory path here. All right, switching over to objective 2 here. This concept here, which I've termed here migratory spatiotemporal overlap, is very similar to migratory connectivity that I talked about earlier. But instead of just being between the breeding and the wintering region, now it's the breeding and the entire migratory period. And so, as you all know, in the stationary breeding and wintering period, and I say stationary in quotes because there's lots of evidence, especially from these types of tracking technologies, that they're not so stationary. Birds do often move in the overwintering period or even within the breeding period, but it's a much more stationary. And so all that's relevant there is changes in space, right? So we're looking at how populations are distributed in space between breeding and wintering. But in migration, the temporal component is much more important, because birds can leave on migration at different time periods, or they can progress through migration at different speeds. So there's both a spatial component and a temporal component here to the migratory connectivity, but during migration, or what I'll mostly refer to it as spatiotemporal overlap. So just to give an example here, I'm going to explain these figures. These circles here represent distinct breeding populations, these bigger circles, and these smaller circles represent individuals leaving from a given breeding population. And so in this example here, the individuals from these 3 populations are not overlapping at all. This is a snapshot in time, and you can see on this date that these individuals from the yellow population are on the Gulf Coast. These from the teal population are still in the Midwest, and these purple individuals are still up near the Great Lakes. And so there's no overlap in space and time. And so this would be considered very high migratory connectivity to connect it back to the concept that we covered earlier, or low overlap in space and time, which is often more intuitive. You can see that these individuals are not overlapping in space or time. On the other hand, individuals here left from their breeding regions, they all converged on the same migratory route, and you can see that in this snapshot in time, these individuals are completely mixed up. And so essentially this can have similar implications for understanding population trends and identifying areas that may be important for conservation action. So what we saw in the whippoorwill here, this figure on the left shows the latitudinal progression of migration as migration advances through time. So for example, let's take this individual. This individual left very early. This was a Wisconsin or a Northern Ohio individual, right? You can see here the color coding that left early in early September, and then had a stopover period here and then continued on migration. And so what you'll notice here, we just included latitude in this figure because as you saw in the migration track figure that I showed just a few slides back, all these individuals, I'll just go back a few slides here if I can. All these individuals basically avoided the Gulf of Mexico, and so they were converging in space here. I want to highlight that there are tracks that go over the Gulf of Mexico, but there were no actual points, that GPS locations that were taken over the Gulf of Mexico. So we have good evidence that these individuals are completely avoiding the Gulf of Mexico here. Sorry for backtracking there. Okay, so this is just the latitudinal progression because in longitude, there's very little difference. All these individuals are rounding the Gulf of Mexico, and the longitude, basically the change in longitude became negligible as migration progressed. But you can see here, especially in these first 2 weeks of October, that all these lines start converging in time and space. So essentially, there's a lot of overlap that we're seeing in these first 2 weeks of October, starting at about 35 degrees north latitude, which you can see here on the map is getting into this region that was an important stopover location, and also as individuals are rounding the Gulf of Mexico. So this again is high spatiotemporal overlap. There's high overlap in space and time and low migratory connectivity. I thought this was just really cool. This is basically a snapshot in time here on October 5th. This was the location of all these individuals. And so individuals that were starting as far apart as 1,000 kilometers, the distance between southern Missouri and northern Wisconsin is about 1,000 kilometers. On average, on this date, we're only 350 kilometers apart. So that's what I'm talking about, that overlap in time and space here. And this blue cross represents the mean latitude and longitude of these individuals on the given date. And it's about 150 kilometers east of Dallas. So you can see the urban gauntlet of cities that these whippoorwills are having to traverse as they're migrating here. And this could be potentially a big threat to these individuals as well. Anthropogenic structures cause a lot of mortality in birds. So you can see here, these are the numbers of annual mortality per year in birds. And buildings are by far the biggest culprit at 340 million birds per year. And it's especially interesting or problematic in this case because birds tend to be disoriented and actually attracted to light. And so as I highlighted there, Dallas and Houston are right there on out of those 4, Dallas, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio were the 4 big major cities that these birds are having to traverse or avoid as they're migrating around the Gulf of Mexico here. And Dallas and Houston were actually the second and third most potent, or the urban centers that emitted the most light in the entire United States, only after Chicago. And so these two cities, or really these 4 cities, could be super problematic for whippoorwills, and there's a lot of birds that migrate around the Gulf of Mexico like that, and so it could be problematic for a whole suite of migratory birds. And so I want to highlight a cool conservation action that people have been promoting in recent years, which is the Lights Out campaigns. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with this. And basically what they're trying to promote is that big urban centers, these big buildings, the skylines turn off their lights at during specific dates and during specific times. And also the residences, you know, people who are just living in their homes can have an impact by turning out their lights at night. And so the studies like ours on the whippoorwill that highlight this key period and a key location can really influence when specific cities, when it's recommended for specific cities to turn off their lights. So I want to take a quick detour here from my research and just highlight this really cool tool called Birdcast. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with it. And this is really what most scientists and conservation practitioners are using to come up with these lights out recommendations, these dates. And basically what it is, it's using the same weather radar technology that I talked about in the very first slide of the presentation to estimate the biomass of migrating birds and other migrating animals as well, but they can differentiate between birds and other animals to understand when birds are moving. And I especially wanted to highlight it for this group because you guys are likely avid birders. And so you can actually predict migration going forward in time as well. So this, I just hopped on earlier today and got the predicted migration intensity for the night of April 25th, tonight. And I was really excited about it because I originally thought this talk was geared at people in Delaware, the state, not Delaware, Ohio. And as you can see, Delaware, the state, is going to get a nice little push of migrants tonight. You can see here, again, the warmer colors represent greater migration intensities. And sadly for you guys in Delaware, I'm not sure exactly where you all are in Ohio, but it looks like it's going to be a lower intensity of migration. So I'm sorry about that. Rich, I'm also hoping that that you can help facilitate the distribution of these slides to anyone that's interested. Here's the link for Birdcast in case anyone wants to explore that site more. There's a lot of cool stuff on there as well.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Okay, finally, I just want to say that this research, everything I've talked about up to this point was recently published in the journal Diversity and Distributions. Yeah, in an article here, and this link, again, you guys can click on it and it'll take you right to the article in case anyone is interested in reading a little bit more about the research that I've talked to up to this point. I'm going to switch gears here and just take a quick sip of water. Okay, so for our third objective, getting back to the fine scale winter ecology and ultimately trying to predict how home range size varies with changes in land use. That's kind of the ultimate goal here. But to back it up a little bit, these archival GPS tags that I showed you guys, they don't give you home ranges. What they give you is essentially points in space and associated timestamps for each point. So this is kind of what that looks like for in a given individual. These figures here are all the same individual, just to explain the flow here. And so our challenge was to take these points and turn them into a home range. And what we used here was in our package that calculated autocorrelated kernel density estimates, which is not super important. But basically it was just taking estimating the areas that had the highest probability of space use for a given individual. So you can see here, this is what the home range actually looked like for this individual. You can see it included some points and didn't include other points. And it's a little more complicated than that. And I'm happy to take any questions at the end if it's of interest. And so then our next task was to try to digitize the land cover using this satellite imagery here into land cover classes like agriculture, forest, scrub, and so on. I want to also highlight here that we used the center of each individual's home range, and we took a 500-meter buffer around that, and we termed that the site. So there's the scale of the home range, essentially everything that's happening within this smaller polygon of the most concentrated space use, and then there's this 500-meter radius circle around the home range called the site. And that's this white circle in this example. And that was what we used to delineate the space that we were going to digitize in that step. And so again, part of the benefit of expanding the study, the extent of this study, the number of individuals that were tagged, is that we could actually test hypotheses about space use. And so we tested hypotheses, or we tested predictor variables about latitude, longitude, distance to the nearest coast, and ecoregion. Ecoregion was essentially these broad scale habitat classifications like dry forest or humid forest. And we binned all of these types of variables in a framework, a hypothesis framework. And we termed these geographic scale variables, right? These are big picture variables. And then, oh, sorry about that. We also calculated the same set of shared variables at two smaller spatial scales. So the same spatial scales I just mentioned, the site and then the home range. And the variables that were included in those two scales were the percent of forest, agriculture, and scrub. We were particularly interested in agriculture, so we also created a categorical variable, basically the presence or absence of agriculture, and then the amount of edge. And the amount of edge is a proxy for fragmentation. Okay, on to some results here. We found that forest, again, was super important. It was found in all home ranges, and overall it accounted for over 80% of the land covers in the home range. There were 9 out of 25 individuals that only had forest in the home range. And we found some marginal evidence that that birds were actually selecting for forest in the home range relative to the amount of forest in the site. So that they were utilizing, or they were using forest at a proportion greater than what was available to them in the surrounding site. Okay, this figure here is a little bit tricky, but I'm going to break it down. So this figure here shows the model averaged parameter estimates and their confidence and their associated confidence intervals for the given predictors of home range size. So these were the predictors of home range size that I've been talking about. I didn't include any predictors at the geographic scale because it turned out that none of them were relevant or significant. So what's shown here are just the landscape composition and configuration metrics at the home range shown here in red and at the site shown in teal. And basically the variables that are important are those that don't overlap 0. Basically, if one of the confidence intervals overlaps 0, that's saying that this variable might have a 0 effect on home range size, or it might not be important. So this next figure here, I've just highlighted in red all the variables that don't overlap 0, or the ones that were important for predicting home range size. So first, this ruggedness variable, this was just a variable that was used to standardize home range size across sites of different terrain ruggedness, but it wasn't actually a variable of interest. So I'm not going to talk about it any more than that right now, but I'm happy to receive questions on it later if it's of interest to folks. So edge here, that was a proxy for fragmentation. That had a positive impact on home range size. So essentially the way that we would say that is the more fragmentation there was at the scale of the site, the larger home ranges were. Conversely, the greater the amount of forest in the site, the smaller the home ranges were. And finally, the presence of agriculture at the scale of the home range, when agriculture was present, it resulted in larger home ranges. So I just want to talk about a few conclusions here, and we can wrap up so there's still some time for questions. But essentially what we found here in this last objective was that the conversion of forest to agriculture did increase space use. And this could be potentially problematic for the whippoorwill and lots of other neotropical migrants, because there's a global deforestation hotspot in the core of the whippoorwill wintering range. So if we think back to that first objective, this region in southern Mexico and northern Central America was the core of their wintering range. And you can see these big deforestation dots here represent that deforestation hotspot. And I've been impacted by this this figure here. 55% of new agricultural land comes at the expense of intact forest in the tropics. So if there was a way that agriculture could stay on the land that's already being used for agriculture, I think that could be potentially really impactful for the whippoorwill and other neotropical migrants. This figure here shows the dynamic nature of land use change in the core of the whippoorwill wintering range. You can see that there's a lot of reforestation as well, and that's reforestation through succession. So that's basically what I was just talking about. They're abandoning old agricultural lands and going into primary forest and using that for additional agricultural land. And we don't really understand the value of primary versus secondary forests to the whippoorwill yet. As I mentioned, we were using satellite imagery to classify, to digitize these land use categories. And you can't easily differentiate between primary and secondary forest with that methodology. So all we could do was say this is forest of some sort, but it could be that secondary forest isn't as useful, or it's, who knows, maybe it's more useful. That's an area for future study. And I kind of want to just float this as a possible outcome of the increased space use as land use changes, to highlight a potential reason why this could be a conservation problem. So essentially, you can imagine if a bird or if a species is using additional space, there might be increased competition between those individuals or neotropical resident birds that are using similar resources. And ultimately that could lead to a decreased carrying capacity in the region. So just to kind of walk through that one more time, this figure here shows that as you increase density of birds, which is essentially another way of saying there's increased competition, apparent annual survival decreases. And so if there's fewer birds that can be housed in a given area, that's going to decrease the overall carrying capacity of a habitat of a given size. And that's what this figure here is showing for grizzly bears in this case, but basically just that as higher quality habitats can house or can house higher densities of wildlife. Okay, so trying to bring it all together here, what does this all mean for the declining whippoorwill? Essentially, we found that there was high spatiotemporal or high overlap in space and time during the non-breeding season. So events that occur outside of the breeding season are going to impact individuals from across the entire breeding range. This doesn't help explain variation in breeding grounds population trends. If you remember that first map I showed with the reds and the blues representing different population trends, this finding doesn't really help us explain those differential trends too much. But it can kind of be viewed as a conservation challenge and an opportunity. As I've just mentioned, there's lots of land use change and deforestation occurring on the whippoorwill wintering grounds. And so that's the conservation challenge right there. Negative events are going to impact individuals from across the entire breeding season. But on the other hand, if there are effective targeted conservation measures that are implemented in these key areas, so that might be the region where a lot of individuals are stopping over, or that area of high spatiotemporal overlap in Eastern Texas on migration, or in the core wintering area. Those positive impacts are also going to reverberate through populations across the breeding grounds. So the last thing I'll say, I'm going to end with this figure here, and this is kind of my best explanation for what's going on here in the case of the whippoorwill and these differential population trends that I talked about on the first or at the beginning of the presentation. This figure here represents 3 distinct breeding populations experiencing 3 distinct population trends. So this here shows the overall population trend. So the red population is declining precipitously, the yellow is declining but only slightly, and the green is actually increasing. All of these 3 populations share a common wintering grounds here in Africa in this case. And so you can see that the overall population trends from the wintering period are consistent across all 3 populations. They're slightly negative in all 3 cases. And that's probably what's happening in the whippoorwill. You know, there's clearly some negative population pressures on these birds on the wintering grounds there, but it's not potentially as disastrous as like northern South America, the example that I showed with the golden wing warblers, for example. But in this case here, back to this figure, sorry, it's really the events that are occurring on the breeding grounds that are ultimately determining the differential population trends. So this population in red here is declining precipitously. This one in yellow is about stable or even slightly increasing on the events on the breeding grounds. And this one in green, the breeding grounds events are super productive, and they're actually, the population trends are actually positive in that case. And so this just goes to say that it's a combination of the events occurring throughout the full annual cycle that determine the the population trends, which tend to be measured on the breeding grounds when birds are most conspicuous or easiest to survey. So that's all I got. I'll end it there. I want to acknowledge my committee, which was incredible, especially my advisor, Chris Tonra, all the collaborators on this project, my lab mates, additional faculty at The Ohio State University, and all the folks that helped with land access. And with that, I am happy to open it up to any questions. And I'll stop sharing for now. And yeah, I'm happy to go back and revisit any of the slides if folks are interested in seeing anything again.
Thank you very much. That was great. So before we get started with the questions, I hope that the fact that Zoom kicked me out for about 2 minutes there in the middle didn't affect all of you. When I came back on, looks like things were going smoothly anyway. Aaron was talking normally, so I hope that didn't happen. But I tried to share something on chat, and apparently that killed my computer connection. Maybe it was too much bandwidth for it, believe it or not. It seems like chat would be minimal. But anyway, I hope that wasn't a problem for you. Anyone with a question? You want to go ahead and unmute?
You're muted just here at the end there, Rich.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I unmuted myself a little too quickly. I'm going to mute myself now. Okay, well, I'll jump in with a question. So how effective has the Lights Out program been in Dallas? Are they they starting to get good compliance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do not know the answer on, any specific cities. I know overall, I think the program's been a good success, and it's definitely raised a lot of awareness, especially about, the effects the anthropogenic impacts that we're having on wildlife, and showing people that with relatively simple solutions, we can have a positive effect on wildlife. But I don't know about any of the whether mortality rates have declined or anything like that. I couldn't say.
Anyone else with a particular question before I jump in with another one?
Yeah, Rich, I have a question or two, I guess. Aaron, you said the GPS tags, do you have to capture the bird each time in order to get the data?
Yeah, we do have to capture the birds. With this particular tag, you do. There are heavier tags, so birds that are, if you study raptors or waterfowl, life is easy for you. You can put tags on that will actually transmit the data back to you. But for small passerines, we're still not there yet, and you do have to recapture the birds. And I guess I'll just add to that the only reason that we have good luck with that as ornithologists is because a lot of birds have really high site fidelity, so they return to the same breeding patch year after year after year, and you can go and set up a net and we would put on the song of the whippoorwill, and they would come in and try to defend their territory and fly into the net. And most of the time the bird, if it survived, goes back to that same exact patch. Sometimes they'll be in a neighboring patch or something like that, but usually within a pretty small radius right around where you caught them the first time, you can catch them again.
And you do the captures in the breeding territories or in the wintering territories?
Yeah, we capture them on the breeding grounds. They're a lot more responsive to playback. So when we put on that their song, they are likely not going to respond. Or we actually went down to Mexico to try to see if we could capture whippoorwills, and we did not capture any we captured some Mexican whippoorwills, but not any Eastern whippoorwills on the wintering grounds. But on the other hand, you put up you play their song on the breeding grounds, and they're loaded up with testosterone, and they're pissed off that there's another male in their breeding territory, and so they'll come in and try to beat the other guy up, and that's when they'll fly right into our nets.
So are they all males?
Yeah, we caught a few females, but predominantly we captured males, and we did put a tag or two out on females as well, and we have that information, but ultimately the recapture rates are never going to be as high because they're not as territorial as the males. So it's less likely that they'll fly back in the following year and try to defend their territory. So it's just not as cost effective, I guess, to put tags out on female birds.
And then you talked about competition in the wintering ranges. I'm thinking that there must be a lot of aerial nocturnal birds and bats, or many different species that they compete with.
Yeah. There definitely are. I think the common paraki, I think, is a big one that's super widely distributed throughout their entire wintering range, if I'm not mistaken. There's the buff-collared nightjar. We did some surveys in Chiapas, Mexico, to try to get at this question of, are there potentially antagonistic relationships between these species? And there were 5 resident nightjar species that we were surveying for, and I can't remember what they all were. Maybe, but the Mexican whippoorwill, common paraki, buff-collared nightjar, if I'm not mistaken, dusky nightjar, dusky-throated nightjar. Anyway, I'd have to look back at our list, but there's definitely resident nightjars that are potentially in the occupying the same niche, and there could be lots of competition for resources on the wintering grounds there.
And then I guess my last question, the range that you were showing in Mexico, is that the total winter range of whippoorwills?
No, I can. This is not what I wanted to share, but it should do the trick anyways. So these are the 50% core utilization distributions, which essentially means similar to like what I was explaining with the home range. It's the highest 50% probability of finding a whippoorwill would be in this small region. So to get the other 50% of whippoorwills, you would have to spread out over their entire wintering range, which goes into Florida, southern US, eastern Mexico, all the way down to Costa Rica. But if you wanted to capture 50% of the wintering whippoorwills, you could go right here to this blue circle, or this blue polygon here, and that's where the majority of whippoorwills are. So you can see here, for example, these individuals are outside of this blue polygon, but they're the minority. The vast majority of individuals are right here in kind of in this core wintering area.
Okay, well, thanks.
Great questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think just to clarify, and I think maybe it was clear to everyone, but I just wanted to mention it. You only have to recapture the bird one time when it gets back home to its territory, and then you download the data for all the stops between when you released it with the tag and when you recaptured it. Is that correct?
Yeah, you nailed it. Thanks for clarifying there.
Yeah, that's why they're called archival, I guess, because they're archiving all the data for that whole period. And then you're downloading it all at once at the end when you recapture the bird.
Yeah,
Any
it's really,
questions?
I guess I have maybe a comment, not a question, but you showed like the decline in aerial nocturnal insects since 2007. I guess my own personal experience is that they've been declining a lot before that. I
yeah,
mean, just by, I guess, kind of informal windshield surveys driving at night, you
sure.
don't get insects on your windshield like you used to at night, I guess.
Yeah,
So,
there's, I'll just share my screen here one last time. This figure here was the insect declines, and there are some study, this one goes back to 1990 and is through 2017. And so it's got a little bit more of a temporal range there. But I don't know too many more that have really documented declines more than that. And yeah, it's worth noting that this is not a linear scale here. So this goes from 10 to 5 to 2 to 1. And so if I'm remembering correctly, this study, this is a European study, documented 70% declines in insects in protected areas, which was the really crazy part. So just from the surrounding habitats being changed over that time, there were 70% roughly insect declines over that 30-year period.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that was a very shocking study. Anyone
So
else?
Aaron, do you want to tell us about your current research?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I don't have anything prepared for that, unfortunately. I should definitely have like a summary slide ready to go. But yeah, essentially I'm down here in Colombia. I'm in a really incredible part of the country. It's the easternmost, the Andes actually trifurcate in Colombia. So there's 3 separate cordilleras, they call them, which are like 3 separate mountain ranges, I guess, but all still part of the Andes. And I'm in the eastern side of the eastern, like the eastern foothills, basically. So it's kind of this transition zone between this mega diverse region of the Andes and a very agriculturally heavy kind of floodplain region called Los Llanos. And so it's an incredible area to work. It's absolutely beautiful, and the bird biodiversity is outstanding. As Rich said, or I said, this is kind of just a pilot season so far, and so a lot of what I'm doing right now is just going out and birding and trying to wrap my head around all the different calls and songs and all these tiny little flycatchers that look identical. And so it's been cool. It's been lots of fun. Essentially the plan for the study though is I mentioned extinction and colonization rates, and essentially the idea is to compare, so by doing bird surveys, you can note the presence or absence of birds in a given forest patch. So I'm mostly interested in the species that are forest dependent. Those tend to be the ones that are declining. And so focusing on those birds, you can go to a forest patch in year 1, and with the survey, you repeat a survey multiple times, and let's say you go there 5 times and you say, yep, this species was present in year 1. You go back in year 2, it's present. but then year 3, it's not present, year 4, it's not present, year 5, it's not present, you would say that that species went locally extinct from that forest patch. And conversely, if a species isn't present, and then out of nowhere it's present, you would say that species colonized that local forest patch. And so basically, through surveys, and I'm also going to do some mist netting, which is actually capturing birds. I'm trying to understand whether silvopasture influences the recolonization and extinction rates of these birds from forest patches in these fragmented agricultural landscapes. And I guess more broadly, what is causing the fallout of these birds from fragmented communities? Irrespective of the silvopasture part, there's a couple competing hypotheses about, is it the neotropical birds' poor dispersal ability? Is it their inability to cope with these distinct microclimates that are found in these small forest patches compared to the large forest patches in which they evolved? Is it an increase in predators, particularly nest predators? So I'd say overall, my goal is to try to understand what's causing extinction in these fragmented systems, and then trying to understand if there's a potential solution out there with silvopasture, if that might benefit or at least ameliorate the negative effects of fragmentation in forest dependent bird species.
Wow,
Thanks.
that was really exciting. A lot of amazing stuff. Any more questions from our audience? Okay, well, maybe you're kind of off the hook here, Aaron. It looks like you've answered everybody's questions. That was really fantastic. Thank you so very much. It was really.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. A lot of really interesting information. As far as if no one else has any more questions, you're welcome to stay with us. We'll just be talking about what we've found locally in the last few weeks. This is our last meeting by virtual means and our last meeting of the season. We don't meet through the summer, but we'll start up again in September. We're really hoping, and I think everyone's counting on being able to meet in person starting in September. And we'll probably be meeting at Deer Haven Park again, as we have been in the past many years now. And so that's our intent, and you will be getting a probably midsummer newsletter explaining what's been going on and machinations about that.
Rich, I am gonna sign off. I got a few more things I need to get to tonight, but there was one last thing that I wanted to share with you guys, if that's all right.
Sure.
And I wanted to say thanks again to everyone for tuning in. I really, I appreciate it, and I hope it was interesting. I always, welcome any feedback or anything like that. And the last thing I just wanted to share was my contact information. This is from a presentation I've been given here in Colombia. So sorry, it's in Spanish. But yeah, this is my email, which I can throw in the chat real quick. And this is my Twitter account if anyone is interested in following that. And yeah, it's a lot of fun to share my research. It makes it feel a little less lonely, like I'm just out here in a really tiny bubble of other scientists, and it's great to that other folks show interest. So I'm happy to stay in touch, and maybe in a few years do another one of these with my PhD work or something.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go ahead and and stop the recording at this point. Wait, but we'll stay on for those who want to talk about the birding sightings lately here in central Ohio. But I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks again, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks you guys. I'm just gonna throw this last thing in the chat and then I'm gonna sign off. So it was yeah, great